Hey, welcome everybody. Mark Miller here, and welcome to the Science of Great UI. Today we're going to talk about, well, let me first tell you who I am. Let's get into that first. I've been writing developer productivity tools for about 30 years, focused entirely on tools for developers. I've been researching great design, UI, UX for about 16 years, and I do live coding every week at twitch.tv/CodeRush. That's my email over there. My Twitter account is over there as well. And as Brent said, I'm the chief scientist for the IDE tools team at DevExpress, and I work on this product right here, CodeRush. That's what I do. Here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about importance and emphasis, contrast and readability, borders and spacing, fill and corners, and we're going to talk about polarity as well. Excuse me. Polarity is which theme is better, light theme or dark theme. Importance and emphasis. So emphasis is the ability to make information appear important. For example, I can emphasize with the thickness of the font stroke, or I can emphasize with contrast, saturation, shadow, uppercase, size, or depth. Essentially, one of the ways of emphasizing is another way of thinking about it is change. In other words, if the landscape is all the same and then one thing stands out, that's essentially your emphasis, because our brains are naturally looking for that which is different, because we want to attribute meaning to that which is different or standing out. I can also emphasize with white space around words or around a presentation, right? Emptiness can be used, can facilitate an emphasis. Now, to dive into this more, I want to talk about some superheroes that I know. I know about Batgirl, I know about the Hulk, I know about Scarlet Witch, and I know about this guy right here, Superman. And I know about their powers, their secret identities, and their chances of beating me in a battle. And so let's organize that information. So I'm going to create a table, and across the top, I'm going to list in the header column, the header row, I'm going to list the different things that I know about. And then I'm going to just start putting the data in there. So for Batgirl, her main power is martial arts. Her secret identity is Barbara Gordon, and her chances of beating me in a fight, roughly 100%. The Hulk smash is the main power. Secret identity is Bruce Banner. I'm going to give him 50%. If I sneak up behind Bruce, maybe I can take him. And run. It would be the technique there. Scarlet Witch and Superman. So there's the data we have, right? So the question now becomes, can we separate this presentation of information into two different groups? One where we have high value information and another where we have low value information. And I want you to take a look at this and see if you can divide that up into two different groups, right? How would you do this? And this is actually one of my favorite examples of asking this question, because I think a lot of people, the answer that a lot of people go to reflects kind of what's going on in our minds a little bit, and there's probably a little bit of cognitive load going on here. But if you've identified anything that was text as your low importance, I would suggest instead to look at it like this. And the takeaway here is that everything, here, let me just go full screen here so you can see that there. Everything that you present on screen is information, including the lines, right? The lines of the table. So the lines of the table are the low value information. So if we zoom in, by the way, on those lines and the text, and we just keep zooming in, you can see that the width of the line, the thickness of the line, is the same as the thickness of the font stroke above. And the contrast is the same. The color is the same, right? We're using black on white for both. So the weight of both is the same. Now, what happens if we change that up a little bit? Let's say we take the low value information and we make it really thick and high contrast. And here you can see emphasis is the opposite of importance. And we can also do the other direction right there. And here you can see that emphasis matches importance. Right there. Let's get me out of the shot there so you can see that summary right there. Right? So if we look at those, the question is, here, let me go back here. The question is, which one of these is the easiest to read? And if you're like most people, you're going to say this is the easiest to read. This one right here, right? And how did we get here? We started by asking the question, can we divide it into two groups of information, low value and high value? Notice also with the titles, I'm doing something here. I actually took it a step further and I said, what about my mid value? My middle of the emphasis, of the middle of the importance column or importance chart, what fits in that group? And I said, that's going to be the headers right there. And so what I did is I dropped their contrast a little bit. And the reason I did that is because once you know what's in the column, you don't really need to go back and keep reading it, that sort of thing. So emphasis should match importance right there. Here's an example of, I think, some Parcheesi dice. And I took this picture. We're playing this. We roll the dice out. Lighting is kind of low. It's nighttime. And we're like, what are the values of the dice? And to make things worse, they're rolled on a table that's kind of brown. This is an example of low contrast right here. It's also an example of where we have kind of really important information. Contrast that with this, right? Look at those two side by side. And you can see, well, this is the way to do it right here. This is why these are the kinds of dice you see all over the place, and these harder to find, right? These have not, become the default way we roll dice because it's much easier to read these, right? So we're talking about importance. What's the most important thing? The numbers, right? The number on each side of the die. How do we represent it? We represent important things with a high level of contrast or emphasis. Let's talk about contrast and readability next. The question here on this slide is, does the text on top seem hard to read, and does the text right over here to my left seem easy to read? And if it does seem that way to you, then the question is why? Let's look at what happens when we remove color from the picture. So take a look at what's happened. The text on top is still there, right? But we've taken out all hue and just gone to the black and white perceived brightness spectrum. And when we're on the perceived brightness spectrum, right, it's gone. The takeaway here is that reading essentially happens in black and white. Symbol recognition happens easiest on the grayscale spectrum, which means you want to have contrast between your foreground and background if you have symbols or text that stands out when you take all the color away. That's the lesson learned there. So you want distinct text from background. Here, whoops, there's me right there, gone. Okay, borders and spacing coming in next. So the question is, where do I put my border? And when I was originally researching this about, I don't know, I want to say 5 or 6, 7 years ago, I couldn't find anything any rules or guidelines that said, here's where you put the border. So I started studying the problem. And I came up with some examples. And like these were two of the examples I came up with. And in the one over here on the left, I think we can all agree that border's probably farther away than it needs to be. It's so far away that it's actually closer to the edges of this screen, this presentation, and it to some degree seems more connected with those than it does the text. So it's lost its sense of connection with the text. And over here, I think we can all agree that it's too close. And that's probably, I think most of us would be like, it's too close, but that's about as much as I can go in terms of explaining why. Right? Why is that too close? I actually have some insight into this, why that's too close, and it has to do with the way we recognize symbols when we read. Right? If there's a line near another symbol we've already recognized, then we're trained to then look and see if that's a symbol, like a letter or a number that might be part of the information we're gathering. And if our eyes go to it and we realize it's not, there's a little disruption, a little cognitive blip, where we just kind of a little bit more work is going on in our head because we're like, oh no, that's not it, and let's keep moving. It's like that kind of a thing in a thought. So it's too close right here because of the way we read, and it's too far away here because of something called a proximity guideline, which says that things that are closely related need to be next to each other. Okay? So after taking these things into consideration and studying this, I came up with this rule. You take the width of the space between two letters. You multiply that by 1.5. And that's where you can bring your side borders into. And then you can take that same distance around the top of the T and the bottom of the Y, the descender right there, and that's your border. And that's if your border is the same thickness and the same contrast as the text itself. If you want to get closer, you can actually do it if you lower the contrast. That's not going to interfere with our symbol recognition and our feature detectors, the parts of our brains that are actually involved in reading. That won't mess that up if we lower the contrast, because we're not going to, on the black and white spectrum or the grayscale spectrum, we're not going to confuse that as a symbol. Right? Making sense? We just learned, you know, the piece we learned before about reading totally applies with borders, right? We want to get it closer, we can do that. We can also do another thing, we can make it thinner, right? So we can have it actually be the same contrast as the text, but just make it thinner. And that's another way to solve that problem, if we want to get the border closer. All right. So I just have another way of approaching the problem. Sometimes in my research, I'll draw two side-by-side alternatives. And I'll ask myself and other people, which one do you prefer? So if we do these two, the preference is the one on the right. The one on the right is easier to read, right? You have to have some question like what that reveals your criteria for the decision. So the question here would be, which of these two do you find easier to read and digest? And you get a winner, and you say, okay, the winner is this one right here, and then I draw maybe two more of these. And I say, okay, now which one of these two do you find easier to read? And again, you might say, okay, it's this one. And then I keep going, right? Which one of these two? And if we go back to the beginning, we look at the two extremes, you can start to now get a rule, a guideline. And the guideline here is, look, borders should be thin. And their emphasis should be low, because borders, as we've already seen, they're part of the information we're sending out, but they are a low importance part of the information. Notice also here, I've done something kind of cool that I like to do with the headers of this. I made the header bolded, right? But it's low contrast, right? And there's hue in it. So by making it bold and giving it color, we said these are important. But by making them lower contrast, it doesn't interfere with our ability to actually read the data inside. This is actually one of my favorite techniques for tables right here. What the table you're seeing behind me, it's the way it should work. Now, there are applications, huge applications right now, or huge applications with huge numbers of users right now from major companies that are still doing the borders wrong. Right? You go into an email application, for example, either on the web or a standalone desktop, and a lot of email applications, if you insert a table, will put that table, get those borders really, really thick, and it's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. So borders should be thin and low contrast. Here's an example. That one's wrong. This one's better. Okay? All right, fill and corners are next. So the question here is, I've got two images on screen, and the question is, which one of those two looks bigger to you, right? Which one is a bigger star? And I think most people are going to say the one on the right, the red star, is the bigger star. If we zoom in on them, they're actually contained in the exact same border size. They have the same height and the same width. But the symbol on the right has about 35% more pixels in it. And it's able to do that because that sharp corner there, it doesn't have to fill that, so it's got the round corner, so we can put more pixels there. Right there, you can see a good example right there. Right? So if you're doing icons, small kinds of symbols, symbols that have to be scaled down very small, you want to have rounded corners on those icons, for sure. Salience, sharp versus curves. So salience is this concept of what is attractive to the eye, what does the eye consider important, right? Where does the eye go to look in a field? So the question here is, what is most salient about this shape? Is it that part? Is it these curves inside? Or is it that end right there? And if you're like most people, you'll say that part right there. The sharp corner is the salient part. Now, why is that important? Well, if just like we were talking about emphasis, we need to match emphasis to importance. If I have a symbol, maybe something large, that has sharp corners in it, my eyes are attracted to that section of what's in my field of view, right? If that's important, then that's okay. But if it's not important, then maybe the design should use rounded corners instead. Let's talk about hollow versus filled buttons now for a second here. So there's an example of a hollow button and a filled button right there. And I'm just going to go through and talk about, I'm just going to look at different categories of information for each of these. So the visible pixels, excluding text, there's about 1,000 in that shape up there on the left and about 10,000 over here. Shapes to process, I'm contending there are two shapes to process in that shape. There's an outer shape and an inner shape that we have to kind of identify and recognize. Over here, there's one. It's simpler design, right? Number of corners, there are 8 corners in here because for each corner we actually have 2. So some part of our visual processing has to acknowledge that. 4 over on this side. Peripheral image looks like this. In other words, if I'm not looking at the button and I'm over here, it looks like that. Over here, it's easier to see. Okay? And graphical messages, the border is important. And over here, whoops, that's the button I want to hit right there. Over on the other side, the graphical message is that the button is important. So with all of these, if you start going down through these, the winner is essentially filled buttons, right? For all of these, what I would argue are small reasons. But one of the things that's really interesting is this peripheral image piece right here. If you look at this, right? If you have a buy now button, it should be filled like this. And if you have a cancel order button, that's okay to be either hollow or to have a background color that's low contrast against your background. Because you want them to be able to very quickly find and click this button right here. Okay, so that's the right way to do it right there. If you want somebody to click the button, that's it. You want filled buttons are better. So button example, corners. You want rounded corners. They're better because we're over here, it says by just to be clear, over here, right there. Over there, it's the corners are salient, right? Those 90-degree corners are salient. So our mind is like, okay, we're kind of going to ignore those a little bit, right? So because we need to kind of fight the cognitive load. And here, there's no cognitive load. So make it easier. Do this one. Rounded corners are better. Here's an example of a call out, right? My salient point, that guy right there, that's the important point I want. I want to point to the information. That's where I want my point. I don't need it around the edges. So this is the right way to do it. Okay, corner sharpness needs to match the importance. All right, last topic is polarity. And here we go. So we're talking about, and we've seen this argument a lot. And when we see this argument, it is often a passionate argument. It's like a religious war starter to some degree, at least within the context of what developers can get really passionate about. And so we've got positive polarity over here on the left, which is black text on a white background or a light background. And we have negative polarity, which is light text on a dark background. And the question is, which of these two is better? So sometimes there's a consideration. You know, a lot of people think, well, I work in a dark room or I work in a bright room. And so you often will see anecdotal evidence, people telling stories about how they prefer in the bright room to have a bright screen and or to have a dark screen, right? If they're working in a dark room. And with regards to what's out there in terms of the studies and things like this, what's interesting is there are benefits, potential benefits here that have been studied. And with regards to positive polarity, there are a few that are interesting here. Your visual acuity increases. And the reason it does is because there's a brightness, your irises are actually contracting, which means you have the ability to read text that's that's smaller, right? So you can read smaller text. Your visual acuity increases. And also better customer performance. You generally have a better performance if you're working against a light-themed background than you do against a dark-themed background in terms of whatever the tasks are, how much of the task that you can do in a limited amount of time. And accuracy on complex tasks can go up as well. So these are all different studies with positive versus negative polarity. Can increase the data density. Because you can use a smaller font, we can actually put more data on the screen, which may be useful, especially on small screen devices such as tablets or phones. This data, these benefits are irrespective of the age of the user and irrespective of ambient light. Just flat out, these benefits are here. Also, astigmatism can get a sharper vision as well. The benefits of negative polarity. Oh, shadows. I forgot about shadows. Shadows are actually really important. Shadows for a UI that puts like a window on top of another window. In the real world, we have a natural kind of thing that happens. There's a shadow, a subtle shadow that happens between the two, and it helps our brains separate. It gives us separation on the image and helps us understand that this is on top of the other. If you take out shadows from a UI, and there have been operating systems that had shadows and took them away, I think for maybe performance reasons, or at least in a default setting, right? So their default was no longer to have the shadow on. And when that happened, it became much harder to use the interfaces, right? The interfaces were harder to see the edges. Where's the edge of my window? I'm grabbing to resize it. I think I've got it and I'm missing, that sort of thing. So shadows are really, really important. Okay, benefits of the negative polarity. There are some lot of anecdotal evidence that says they're preferred by users with cataracts. And they've got no shadows, but they do have the ability to do glowing edges, which is not bad. And that's pretty much it at this point. So when you look at the two of these, right, if you're going to answer the question definitively, which one is better, positive polarity or negative polarity, positive polarity is the winner. And that I'm going to wrap up here. I just want to tell you that you can find me out here 4 days a week at twitch.tv /CodeRush. We do live coding in TypeScript and C#, talk about design issues as well. You're welcome to come in live and ask questions anytime. I want to make sure you guys are donating. Your donations are in there. Chef Brent's going to be talking about those as well. And with that, I am going to get out of here. Send back to Brent.